Okay, well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for that very impressive telling,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Very good, sir.
This is the bell. I'm going to take us on a trip to nature, and we're going to make a surprising find. There was a town that was right beside a forest. The people in the town love their forest. They spent many happy hours exploring it. Yes, they considered it their forest. One day, they heard an unusual sound. It was a bell tone, a very rich bell tone. It had a beautiful sound that delighted everyone, and the people in the town thought it must be the church. But it didn't come from their church. The bell tone went away, and then it came back. And every time it came, it was unexpected and beautiful. The people loved the bell. But the bell became quite a mystery. Where was the bell coming from? And everyone thought, maybe the bell is in the forest. And they all trekked into the forest one day. The rich people went on carriages. The poor people went on foot. The baker set up a stand at the pathway to the forest that sold bread and cakes. At the end of the day, everyone had a wonderful time. They were tired in a good sort of way, but they hadn't found out anything more about the bell. Then the king got involved. He said a proclamation. He said, whoever discovers the secret of the bell will get a title. That person will be called Keeper of the Bell. Well, many people came forward with their ideas. And finally, someone came up with a theory. Do you know what a theory is? A theory is something very clever people write. And this man's theory was that the bell was produced by a woodpecker pecking against a tree. And the king said, this is a wonderful theory. I'm going to name you Keeper of the Bell. And every year after that, the man who won that honor wrote a paper about the bell that didn't enlighten anybody. There was a special event that happened in the town every year. It was the annual confirmation of the 14-year-old boys and girls. It was their passage into adulthood. So imagine being a family with a 14-year-old boy or a 14-year-old girl. What a wonderful day that was, but everybody in the town looked forward to the confirmation. There was a beautiful ceremony this year, and at the end of it, the young people were bursting with pride. It was the first day of their adult life. And they said, now that we're adults, let's do something very adult. Let's go into the forest and look for the bell. They all thought this was a great idea, although two boys had to excuse themselves. One of the young men had always been obedient, and he didn't want to do anything unless he asked permission of his parents first. It was a perfectly good reason not to go into the forest, but of course the other young people laughed at him. And the other young fellow excused himself because he was a poor boy who didn't own a suit of fine clothes. He borrowed one from the landlord's son, and he made a firm promise that he was going to return it at the end of the ceremony, and he meant to keep his promise. So the poor boy excused himself, and everybody else linked arms and went into the forest together. It was an impressive display of unity. Now, as you can imagine, the group split up. Some of them lost interest in the bell. They thought picking flowers was a perfectly good thing to do. And one of them was a loner. He liked to go off by himself and do things. But there were 5 young people who were determined they were going to find that bell no matter what happened. They went deep, deep into the forest. And they went so deep they came out the other side, and they came to a farm. And on the farm, they saw a little tiny bell making a little tiny sound. And they yelled and shouted, "We discovered the bell!" Well, one boy disagreed with his companions. He said, "I don't think this is the bell we've been looking for. It doesn't have the fine tone that we've been listening to and delighting in." The boy who disagreed with his companions was the king's son. And the other young people weren't impressed. They said, "Oh, you think you're better than the rest of us because you're the king's son." And then they laughed at him and left. The king's son was stung by their words, but he didn't let it bother him too much because he had important business to do, and he sat down to collect himself. And then he heard footsteps. Clop, clop, clop. A boy burst into the clearing, and it was the poor boy who had to go and return the suit of fine clothes. He'd heard the bell toning, and he was so overwhelmed by the beauty of it, he couldn't resist. He had to go into the forest to go on the search party. When he burst into the clearing and saw the king's son, he shrank right back. The king's son looked so splendid, and he felt so poor and shabby with his torn clothes and his wooden shoes. The king's son wasn't thinking any of this. He was delighted to have a traveling companion. He said, "Let's travel together. Let's go on the right side, because that's the side all the great and wonderful things are found on." And the poor boy said, "Well, I'd rather go on the left side, because that's the side that the heart is on." So the king's son was suddenly disappointed. He wasn't going to have a traveling companion after all, but they wished each other all the best and went their own separate way. The truth is, the poor boy chose the more difficult route. The king's son had a path cleared, but the poor boy had to clear the path himself and move the thorny brambles away while they tore further at his clothes. This isn't meant to be any disparagement of the king's son. He was an explorer and an adventurer. He deserves credit too, and I'm going to follow his travels. He continued on the path and came to a clearing. And what a stunningly beautiful clearing it was. It had white flowers with bright red stamens. It had apple trees with fruit that glistened like soap bubbles. It had a swan flying overhead, making its sad, mournful song. It was a delight for the eyes and the ears, but it didn't please the king's son. All he could think was, the sun is setting. There isn't much time left. I don't have much time to do my work. And then he thought of climbing the hill. I'm sure to see something there. And he ran to the hill and clambered up the hill, holding on to the rocks and stones while the toads and lizards slithered away. He got to the top of the hill, and what a beautiful sight he saw. From the top of the hill, he could look out on the coast. He could see the sun setting on the horizon. He felt the salt breeze blowing in his face. He heard the crashing of the waves on the shore. And then he heard footsteps. Clop, clop, clop. It was the poor boy. He took a completely different route, but he arrived at the same place. They were now delighted to see each other. They embraced and sat down. The grass was like the finest carpet that any king walked on. The trees were like a canopy over their head. They were in the cathedral of nature. That's where the bell tone was coming from. And right at that moment, they couldn't think of a better place to be. That's the story of the bell.
Oh.